Hi, I'm Karin Hurt, and I'm here with our next edition of Asking for a Friend Live. Absolutely delighted to be here with Susan McPherson. And we're talking about how do you build more connected business relationships. And she is the author of The Lost Art of Connecting, a brand new book, which I absolutely love. So, Susan, thank you so much for joining us.
Karin, I am so excited to be here, and your energy is contagious, and the music, everything. So thank you for inviting me to join you.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. So, this is a topic that is so hot on people's minds right now. And on Asking for a Friend, we are all about really practical tools and techniques. And so that is why I really wanted to have you on the show, because it's not just theory. Right? You are absolutely giving people practical ways to approach things. And I loved your model where you have this gather, ask, do model. And it is so consistent with so much that I really believe and how I have built relationships with people all over the world in this leadership space. And I'm like, but she put a model and a framework to some of the things that we try to do intuitively. So first of all, let's start with this concept of gather. When you talk about gather, when you're building connections, when you're building a network, when you're building relationships, what do you mean by gather?
Well, the first part of gather is the very vitally important notion of connecting with the most important person, and that is connecting with yourself. So doing some deep dives to find out, one, what does a meaningful relationship mean to you? Because for everybody, that can be a different thing. Two, what are your goals in the next 4 years, 4 months, hell, even 4 weeks? And what are your superpowers that you can bring to anyone, any situation? And I, in the book, call them your chief differentiating factors. And once you have that, or at least have a sense of that, you can think in the gather phase about who is it that you want to connect to that is going to help you meet those goals or reconnect with? But at the same time, how are you going to be sure you can also be helpful to them? And a last part of gather is ensuring that you are doing everything you possibly can to break that hermetically sealed bubble that many of us experience, and that is connecting with people that look like us, sound like us, the same age as us, the same race and culture as us. So that is very much a very high level look at the gather phase.
I love it so much. So when you think about that, first ground with yourself, why do you even want to be connected? And what is really important in your 3 4s, right? 4 years, where are you headed strategically? 4 months, where are you headed tactically? And then you said, 4 weeks or even 4 days, what are the specific next steps that you really need to do? And I think that's really important. I think a lot of times people feel like, yeah, I should network, or I need to know people, or they have to, we'll get to your ask thing, but they have a specific ask and they're not taking the long view and they're just asking. So this is really a good grounding place to start. Another part that I really enjoyed was your concept and gather of becoming the host. Yeah. So can you talk about that? And then I'll share with you a little bit about how I played with that and how it worked for me. So being the host, what does that mean?
Well, it obviously came out of my own not getting invited to various things, because there's 2 things that can happen when you're not invited. Obviously, you can be sad, which is natural and human. And, I still have memories of coming back on Mondays from weekends in high school and hearing about all the parties I didn't get invited to. And of course, today, every day, we see it in real time, on social media. But there's, we could do JOMO, which is what traditionally is joy of missing out, which can be positive at some point. But I believe instead to deploy the joy of meeting others and taking ownership. And if you're shy or maybe introverted, the idea of hosting is terrifying, but you don't have to do all of the inviting. You can ask 3 people and ask each of those people, whether they're business colleagues or friends, to each also invite 3 people. And by doing so, you're the convener, and you take back a bit of that power that we tend to give up when we're waiting for the invitation.
Oh, very, very good. And I see Anna from Frederick, Maryland. We are actually based out of Laurel, Maryland, so not very far from you. So glad you're here. So and if anyone has a question on connection, please chat in your questions and we will be sure to answer them. When I think about when I very first started blogging, and so I've been a Verizon executive, and so I did not, when you Googled my name at the beginning, all you saw was marathon race results. You did not, so I really need to figure out how to get, invited to the party. How do I get on people's podcasts? How do I do this? How do I, and one of the very best pieces of advice I got was, why don't you be the host? And it wasn't those words, but I built a leadership blog carnival and I invited people to share their blogs and I started curating other people's content. And by being the host, it enabled me to have wonderful conversations with people, all these people who had experience and were being successful in what I wanted to do to get started. And they then were giving me advice and inviting me back. And when you talk about that reciprocation, I think, being the host really did work out for me.
Yeah. Well, and think of everything you've learned, right? And then what you learn, you can share.
Right.
It's concentric circles that build upon each other, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, this is an example of being the host too, right? Yeah. So love that concept. Okay. So let's talk about then the ask, because your ask is it's not just asking, right? So what happens in the ask phase?
Sure. Well, the overall arch of the ask portion of the book is learning to ask the meaningful questions of others so that we can find out what are their hopes and dreams, what are their challenges, what are they trying to accomplish. And if you listen carefully, and I have to say, myself included, we are woefully bad at listening. But if you do everything you humanly can to listen carefully, you have all the data necessary to move to the third and final phase, which we'll get to shortly, but the phase which is do. Also within the ask section of the book, I, of course, tackle that difficult challenge many of us have, and that is asking for help. And I'm happy to go into that, but I want to toss the baton back to you if you want to dive in a little bit more to the overarching theme.
Yeah, you hit on something when you're talking about ask that I think is so important. And we really teach this when we talk about building strategic relationships. I think a lot of people start with their ask of, what do I need? Oh, I need help. I've got a book launch. I've got a program. And so they call people and say, hey, can you help me spread the word? And that is very off-putting if there is not a relationship. And I will tell you that probably by the time this show ends, I will have 40 emails of people who I do not know asking me for help, right? And not that I don't want to be helpful, but I'm like, who are you, right? So I think your advice is so important, where you say, hey, what is most challenging when you're starting to meet somebody for the first time? What's most challenging for you right now? What kind of help do you need? Right? Starting with helping before you're asking.
Well, and I want to say this is not about not taking the oxygen mask first, though, because I think, and this is a wild generalization, but I think you'll understand, Karin, women, we notoriously put others first, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes we don't ask for what we need, deserve, and want. But mm-hmm. what I fervently believe and what I have seen in the last 30 years professionally is when I lead with how I can help, the help comes back.
Yes.
And when you give people options, they are much more likely to respond. But I think what you just said was very interesting, because I'd love to see a show of hands in the audience. How many of you have connected with people on LinkedIn, and then literally within 2 hours, you have someone trying to sell you something without even asking you anything about yourself or what you need or want?
Yeah. And you know what I do on that one? I immediately disconnect.
Now, what if somebody did a little bit of research and found out perhaps that you were joining a board of a nonprofit, or raising a round for a startup company, or you got a new job? And what if they opened it up instead with, wow, I just saw you landed this role, and I happen to know someone who works there. I'd love to introduce you. And oh, by the way, I'd love to chat with you because I have blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
Wouldn't that kind of change the mindset?
Absolutely. And I really also, in this phase, you talk about how important it is to, we think, oh, I have this one chance with this person and I have to get it right. And you said reframe that. Can you talk a little bit about how you reframe that? Because I think that was really helpful.
Well, I want to also reframe another thing that I think sometimes people don't know, and that is generally people want to be helpful. And Karin, you just said that. You want to be helpful to these people, right? But they're not giving you the tools to actually be effective at being helpful. So I think in this case, whatever we can be doing to help others help ourselves, and it is not a one all done all, okay? We have to look at relationships as over time. The reason I named the book The Lost Art of Connecting versus The Lost Art of Networking is I see a delineation between the two. I think of networking as very transactional, quick and dirty, going into a room, getting business cards, maybe following up, maybe not. Connecting, I feel, is much more mano a mano, maybe 1 and 2, but over the long haul, and making little like deposits in the bank account of that relationship over time. I think of Hansel and Gretel and the breadcrumbs, right? Breadcrumbs of relationships. And this way, it takes the pressure off that you have to get it all done. My late father was a professor, and obviously he would lecture because he taught history. But he always said, you want to leave people wanting more. And brevity was the key. Now, clearly, I'm not demonstrating this now because I keep talking, so I'll stop.
Oh, yeah, that's really, really good. You mentioned your father. I would also love to have you talk a little bit about the old school things that your mother did. That was so really interesting to me. We'll just give just a little bit. I know this is a little bit of a sidebar here, but I thought it was so neat what your mom did.
Well, both my parents were super connectors, using the technology of the time, which were manual typewriters and, rotary phones. I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s, and every morning at the breakfast table, they would have the 5 local newspapers splayed out, and yesterday's or the day before's New York Times, because of course it came, a few days delayed in the mail, and they would clip and cut and send those articles to respective people. Well, my mother worked in public relations for PBS, and we lived in upstate. When she would go down to New York City and come back, she would bring back Molinari sausages to give out to reporters in the newsroom, not because she was promoting something for them to cover, but more just to build relationships. And another funny thing that she would do is our house was very small. And being the wife of a professor, we would annually, there'd be parties, right, where students would come. But she would, because the house was so large, we couldn't have 100 people at once. So she would host an open house from 4 p.m. to 7, and then invite people in shifts that would overlap, so that there would never be people who were in the room that might not totally not know each other. So 4 to 6, 5 to 7, and 6 to 8. So that way new people were meeting, but there was already some sense of comfort.
Ah, wonderful. So my husband and business partner, David, is listening, and we have a very small condo, but that might be how we can do parties now. We do them in shifts. Yep. All right. So as David says, asking for friends who are newer in their career. What can they give, offer, or add value to more senior people they want to connect with? I love this question. So while you're getting ready to answer that question, if you were just joining us, I'm here with Susan McPherson. We are talking about the lost art of connecting. And if you have a question for Susan, please drop us a line here. But let's start with this one.
Well, it's a question I get all the time. And this is something that I know when you're young, or even when you're approaching retirement, you start to feel like, wait, what do I have to offer? So that is where that soul searching is vitally important. And no jokes aside, this may be a wild generalization, but young adults coming out of college often are better adept at the new technologies. So sometimes I'll say 2 words, TikTok. I run a communications firm. I have still yet to learn how to use TikTok. So if a young person coming out of college can help me with that, all the power to them, and how helpful would that be to me? So I think what people have to do is get out of this sense of we don't have things to offer, because we may speak a foreign language. We may have, we may have traveled to a place that somebody else is going to, so we can offer advice. I think it's important to not think we have to be rocket scientists, even though that seems to be the flavor of the day the last few weeks in the news.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So we've talked about the gather phase, where you are getting clear with yourself. We've talked about how do you show up and curate, be the host, invite people, and you don't have to do all the inviting, bring other people in. We've talked about the ask, and one of the things you talked about there is, making sure you're starting with being helpful, not just starting with your own ask. And then before we move from ask, the other thing, and this is one of my very favorite terms, which is define your ask.
Yeah.
A lot of times people will, this happened to me when I was in my executive roles, people will say, will you be my mentor? I'm like, what can I do to help you, right? So that would be my response. Oh, I don't know, but just could you be my mentor, right? And I like, define your ask. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. Again, I want to go back to that notion of helping people help us. And if you define and you are very specific, it helps people be responsive, right? I think sometimes we're very afraid to be direct. But if we think about it, what are we afraid of, right? I mean, I sometimes just say to somebody that I have met that I am fascinated by you, and I would love to have the opportunity to get to know you so that I can be helpful to you, and vice versa. And people have said to me how surprising that I have said that to them. And I kind of wonder why. Because to me, first of all, it's kind, it's human, it's generous, and it's honest.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it can be simple. In Courageous Cultures, we talk a lot about, don't just ask people generally for their ideas. Say, you know what, I really need an idea around in this specific area. And I think it's the same thing. What's the ask? Could you introduce me to this person?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. It doesn't, don't overthink it either. I don't want people to think, listening to me, that you have to put this whole archaic thing. Now, I will say, giving people options and choices is optimum if you want to respond and not to be ghosted. So instead of just asking for the funding for something, or your startup, your nonprofit, give them choices so that it's less likely for them to just say, oh, I can't fund, so I'm just not going to respond. So I think funding is one, introductions to 3 other people that might be able to fund, sharing on social media, just the more choices you give, the less likely you're going to be ghosted.
Ah, very, very good. Okay, let's move to the third phase of this, which is the do.
Okay. So do, which is my favorite place to be.
Okay.
And the important thing with do is, I think, as I mentioned earlier, if you ask the meaningful questions and you listen, you then have all the data to be able to then act upon it. But sometimes, and maybe even more than sometimes, we fall off because we don't follow up, right? Yeah. Things get in the way, and I understand it. And especially in the last 18 months, life has been very, 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 and uber challenging for many, many, many people. So I want to just say, give grace, right? If people don't follow up with you right away, there could be something, very serious going on. But the more quickly we can follow up, and also remember something that was in the discussion, because to me, there's no greater gift we can give one another than showing people that we saw them and we heard them, right? And that we actually listened. So what I like to do, whether it's a virtual meeting or a meeting in person, which some of us are starting to do again, is as soon as I get home, even on my way home, I will voice memo myself so that I don't forget. And that way I will do it as soon as I get home.
Oh,
that doesn't happen, but if you voice memo yourself, you have a little bit of that breadcrumb trail to follow up.
We call that in winning well terms, scheduling the finish, right? So absolutely. And, that's another area you can schedule the finish. And, all right, I'm going to schedule the follow-up. I don't even necessarily know what the follow-up will be, but I'm going to circle back with this person in 4 weeks, or getting that on the calendar. I could do a better job with that. That's
I love it. I'm going to borrow that from you if you don't mind. I will give credit where credit is due.
And I think the other thing you talk a good bit about is having a system. And, sometimes I think people think, I had this one COO who I was working with, and he's like, Karin, I'm missing that gene. And he was talking about recognition, but he was also talking about connection. It's just the whole human side of things. And, I think that with people who are challenged in that way, it feels bad to them to make connecting a task, but that's exactly what they need to do, make connecting a task. And you talk a good bit about systems, one of the systems that I had, my largest organization that I led was 10,000 people. Well, you can't possibly know 10,000 human beings, right? But you are having connected conversations. So what I would do is when I would go into these call centers and I would have a human conversation with somebody about their child or their pet or that they were running a marathon, I would take an index card, write their name. And so I'd put that in that call center folder so that when I went back to revisit, I didn't have to remember it all, but I could. And it's not disingenuous, right? Because they still felt seen. So what kinds of thoughts do you have on systems like that?
Well, I am very old school and I carry around a notepad with me. So I think you and I are like sisters from another mother. I take photos of people, not to share on social media, but to make notes so that I don't forget, because I think sometimes the visual reminder is helpful. And the other thing I do, and I don't know if I could really call this a system, but do you know when people pop in your brain and you say, oh, I'll get, I'm thinking of them, but I'll get to them later? Unless I'm in a meeting like this, I will do it right then. And I will send a quick little missive. And I think I'm hearkening back to my late parents to just make it happen. And I will send out like a, Michelle, I'm thinking of you. David, how are you? No, really, in 3 words, tell me how you are. I typically wouldn't do that because when I do these things, I'm not expecting a response, but I want to at least let people know I'm thinking of them. And that's my way of like just continuing the relationship. And it's not that I have a hidden agenda. I mean, they pop in my brain.
Yeah.
And I know how good it feels when I am the recipient of those kind of messages. So I find it's just a wonderful way to move through life, both personally and professionally.
I love it. We're actually out in our Colorado studio, so we're not not at home at this moment. My girlfriend just sent me a text yesterday and said, I'm 6 blocks from your house in Maryland, and I don't have time to stop, but I just am thinking of you, and I realized how close I am to you, right? And I thought there was no response required. Of course, I responded, but that it really did brighten my day to know that I was on someone's mind. So.
Amazing.
All right. I want to turn, unless there's more, if you are listening and you have a question for Susan, please type it in. In the meantime, I would like to switch to this because our clients, we're hearing two buckets of things that are happening as people are returning or not returning to work that relate to connecting. One is I'm hearing, I'm an introvert and I actually really loved working from home, and now I'm having to return. And honestly, the thought of connecting is exhausting me. So that's one side. Then the other side I'm hearing is, oh my gosh, we're now in this work from anywhere thing. And I was hoping we'd go back, but it doesn't look like a lot of people are going back. And I can't even imagine dealing with the Zoom fatigue for the rest of my life. How do I connect remotely? So can we try to take both sides of that?
Yes. And, these are difficult questions because this is a new world that, there's not a roadmap, there's not a handbook. And I think first and foremost, it's vitally important to give ourselves grace. And I don't even think we've begun to get our heads around what this psychologically has done to all of us, right? So I think we have to literally follow our own kind of what feels comfortable to us and not force things that don't feel right. For those of us who can get out and have a feeling of wanting to get out, do it. I mean, if you're comfortable doing so, but start small, right? You don't have to put yourself in a room of 60 people if you just don't feel comfortable. In terms of colleagues and meetings, the onus in my view, in many cases, is going to be on your management, your leadership of the company. If you run a company, please be conscious of this and try to make space at the beginning of meetings, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, to actually help people feel comfortable, right? You can't assume that everybody is going to feel comfortable just because you say, bring your full self to work, right? I mean, we know people have real trauma and rightfully so. So in other words, what are you doing if you run a company or in a management position to help others feel comfortable? Are you opening up yourself? So to me, I think it's 2 ways. One, allow yourself some grace and do what feels comfortable for the foreseeable future. And 2, if you're not a manager, suggest to your management this, but if you are a manager, this is your time to really step up and be open to new ideas about connecting and not relegate it to the annual sales conference. Because we know a connected workforce and connected employees are more productive, are happier, are much more likely to stay at the company longer.
Thank you. And so, and what do you do for the folks who say, you know what, we're going to stay remote and I am not connecting like I used to? What advice do you have for people to connect in a remote world?
I think the most important thing is to be proactive if you can. And what I have done very successfully over this last year and a half is use the comments feature in various platforms that we're using and then take it offline to the phone. Okay. I mean, granted, I'm of age, so the phone is totally natural for me, but I know for some people it may not be. But I have been very proactive when I've been in events, on Zoom. I take a photo of everybody the mosaic.
Yeah.
And in some cases, I will then reach out to people that were in that event and bring the commonality of the uncommonality, right? We both attended that event. We both have interest in that particular subject matter. And I'd love to learn more and perhaps hear some things I could be doing to be helpful.
So nice.
Yeah, I mean, it is work, right? And you could plan to do 2 of these a week, right? But it keeps you, meeting new people and connecting on a deeper level than just that constant, connecting on LinkedIn and then never having a clue who you talk to.
I am such a believer of taking that offline. And so I love the idea of thinking about you're in a meeting, the Zoom, and then you say, okay, who here do I want to go deeper with? And initiating that, again, being the host. And, I think what you're mentioning is the same, very similar from social media. And I can tell you that there are people that I have met through social media, through Twitter, through LinkedIn, where they have become real friends, like real life friends. And, one example was a guy who I met he reached out to me over LinkedIn. It's led to another conversation. He happened to be in Malaysia. So I helped him a little bit with some stuff that he was working on. And then as it turns out, we were keynoting the HR Asia conference, which was in Singapore, but Singapore is not very far from Malaysia. And once you're all the way over there, so I reached out to him and I said, hey, you know what? As it turns out, I'm going to be in your neighborhood. And that whole conversation, he's like, well, why don't we host an event together? Why don't I bring 150, C-level folks together? You can bring your content. We'll bring our content. Let's do this together. We made it happen. My son and my father came with us. So then we spent like 3 days. We went to dim sum and that all from a relationship that started where it could have just ended, right? So I think that's the real joy of this connecting.
Yes, I think what you just shared is the magic. Thank you for sharing that, Karin. I mean, you could have written this book.
I wouldn't go that far. All right, we are coming to the top of the hour, so I'd like to give you a moment just to answer, one piece of advice or one thing you would, if somebody's going to take one thing away, what would be your best advice for someone who's yearning for better connection?
Well, I would tell you this. For any of us who thought making connections wasn't worth your time, the science shows if you make a meaningful attempt at building connections and meaningful connections over your lifetime, your life will be longer, even more than if you ate kale every day and ran every day. It is extraordinarily healthy for you. So if you ever needed a reason, now you have.
Thank you so much. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And I just want to really thank you.
Karin, thank you.
Okay, so we have a nice lineup. Continue to have a number of wonderful guests. So we are going to be working with April next week on Asking for a Friend. And we're talking about how do you continue to thrive in a period of constant change. So again, a very, very timely topic, and we're looking forward to having April. We hope you will join us. And just also want to remind you that we have normally do not do open enrollment leadership programs, but we have one at your request this fall. So I would love to have you learn more about that. I'll put a link to more information about that in the comments as well. So again, we'll see you next time on Asking for a Friend.